Welcome once again to Wesley Impact and our series on John Wesley. We have arrived in the city of Bristol to this special place at the very heart of John Wesley's ministry. And we've arrived on a special day, the 24th of May. And on that day, Methodist people the world over celebrate the wonderful heartwarming experience and conversion of John Wesley. And as we in Australia are remembering 200 years since the first Methodist preachers, so we celebrate here the beginning of that wonderful movement, and we shall meet some fascinating people.
Today, the New Room Chapel at the heart of Bristol remains in regular use for worship, cultural activities and exhibitions. The building features many original objects and furnishings from Wesley's day.
David, it's good to talk to you here in the New Room in Bristol. Tell us why this chapel was important.
Well, it's important because it's the oldest Methodist building in the world. The chapel as it is today dates from 1748, although Wesley built the original New Room in 1739, just a few short months after his arrival in Bristol to carry on the field preaching begun by a friend of his from Oxford University's Holy Club, George Whitefield. So Wesley arrived, I think, with expectations of taking over a ministry that Whitefield had begun, but maybe not with any understanding about how this would form a ministry for the next 50 years. Travelling around all over England and Scotland, Ireland and Wales on his faithful horse to go and to preach in the open air, but of course in other locations.
Now, John was very much a person of strategy. Those are the kind of language you use today. He wouldn't understand that language, but he certainly knew about strategy. He went to Newcastle upon Tyne at the Orphan House in City Road and here. And this became an important centre, particularly for the west of England, didn't it, for his ministry?
Yes, this essentially was the main base for the southwest. This was the location that the preachers would use, including John, of course, to go down to Devon and Cornwall, across to South Wales, across to Ireland, and of course many of those who are the founders of the American Methodist Church, people like Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke, began their journeys from here in Bristol.
There are many features in this building that reflect that age, but there are some interesting ones too. There are not many windows in here because Wesley didn't like paying any taxes he didn't need to pay, but also there's windows where John might be able to watch the preachers too.
Yes, of course, Wesley needed to offer some rooms above, and that's why we have our museum upstairs in what are now known as the Preachers' Rooms. There is a window which people can look out of today, the same window that John would have looked out on to listen and to watch those preachers. John was most anxious to ensure that those who were preaching in the name of Methodism were preaching the salvation of God, that they were not preaching in a way that John felt would bring the movement into disrepute. I personally have observed to many groups who we welcomed here that I may be preaching from that top pulpit, but then if I saw Mr. Wesley's silhouette at the window, at that point perhaps I might lose my concentration a touch. But all part of John's strategy to ensure that the movement was kept as pure and as holy as was possible.
We often talk in Methodist preaching terms about being on trial. There could be nothing more on trial than knowing that John Wesley was watching you from the window, couldn't there?
Absolutely, and of course the issuing of class tickets that began here in Bristol, and if it was felt that you were not living up to the ideals of the movement, of course those class tickets could be withdrawn. And not only would they be withdrawn, but John would state publicly the reasons why they had been withdrawn. So if you were to become involved with the Methodist movement, this was not a one commitment, this was something that you were expected to continue in your daily life and commitment and walk with God.
And the horse fair gives the feeling of what it was like for John, who of course, as you rightly point out, was on his horse. But today this chapel is locked in a very modern shopping centre here in the city of Bristol. How important is it to maintain the witness here of the work?
Personally, I think it's absolutely vital. This is now the only Methodist chapel in Bristol city centre. I think it's important that people know that city centres don't have to be exclusively for retail and for shopping. The work that goes on here is varied in the same way that it was in John's time. We make this building available for people to come and enjoy the space, to take some time out from the day perhaps to just pause and reflect and have a spiritual moment. For others, they're here purely as somebody who wants to learn the history of the Wesleys, but in telling the story of the Wesleys, you talk about the Christian faith. Others, of course, want to learn more about Bristol as a city. Its links, of course, with maritime. And again, there is a Wesley link there when you think of the preachers who went over to America from this city.
Now, John got very involved late in his life. We know well that his last actual recorded letter was to William Wilberforce to encourage him to not only fight slavery in this country, but also that North American slavery, which he considered to be the worst of all. But he also preached against slavery in this city, didn't he?
And in this very chapel, possibly the most significant preaching was the Thoughts Upon Slavery sermon that Wesley preached here in 1788. He 2 days previously said that he would be preaching on the subject, and we understand from his journal that the room here was packed, waiting expectantly for Mr. Wesley to share his views. He records in his journal that during the course of his sermon there was an uprising, and for 6 minutes complete chaos ensued here at the chapel. Wesley, I think, thought that this was darker forces trying to interrupt what he had to say. And yet, within a short distance after that, everything calmed back down, and Wesley then continued preaching his sermon.
And the sermon would have a particular poignancy because of the city of Bristol anyway, because slavery would be part of the story, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and of course Bristol is a maritime city, it is a trading city, and goods like tobacco, of course, and spirits and slavery. And so Wesley was certainly challenging not only the authorities here in the city, but of course many of those whose employment and day-to-day welfare depended on the slave trade, those working in the docks or on the ships. So he wasn't just taking on the establishment, he was taking on the whole of the city. I think that's one of the main reasons why the uprising ensued here at the chapel at that time. He was there challenging a lot of views that were entrenched, a lot of views that people shared around the way in which society should operate. And of course, Wesley was maybe one of the first people to say that everybody has rights and responsibilities, everybody should have a care and concern for others. This building, of course, was used as a dispensary for medicines, well, of course, before any National Health Service operated. And of course, one of the first things that the Kingswood miners who Wesley engaged with here in the city wanted was an education for their children. And so this was used as a schoolhouse. So what we try and offer today, we hope again reflects that Wesleyan principle of the building being used for multiple different purposes. In that sense, we hope that we are carrying on John's spirit today.
And that reflects John's grasp of the wholeness of the gospel, doesn't it? For him, the gospel was not merely about either saving souls or caring for bodies or caring for this or educate. It was all those things at one and the same time.
Absolutely. I don't think John would ever have considered himself a social reformer. He would always consider himself a preacher and evangelist doing God's work. But, as you rightly say, he had a concern for the whole person. A word we use today in a holistic sense, but I think a very radical thing to do in the 18th century. People, of course, for the first time were coming off from the fields and into the growing cities. And again, this was an opportunity for Wesley and those Methodist preachers to engage with a much larger group of people than perhaps previously.
David, if I might just ask you to sum up in a sentence or so, what do you think John Wesley has to teach us today?
What has always struck me about Wesley's ministry is his obedience to God's calling. I think that there were perhaps other opportunities or other avenues that John might have pursued, but he seems clear that this is the role which God has called him to do. And I think that in that sense he was obedient in his ministry for those whole 50 years. I think our challenge today is to find out what God wants for us and to be obedient to that calling in the way that John was.
And in the city of Bristol, right in the heart of the shops, we think of you, we shall pray for you, and we shall continue to be committed to the work that God has called you to also.
Thank you very much.
And just like in Wesley's day, members of the Methodist community gathered to celebrate the spiritual and social significance of John Wesley's conversion through sermon and song. The day also providing an opportunity to unveil another transformation. The new room's former car park has now been remodelled into a tranquil oasis. Among the special guests, Bristol's Lord Mayor and the students and principal of Kingswood School in Bath.
Simon Morris, it's good to talk to you, particularly in your role as the head of Kingswood. Now, John Wesley had a tremendous impact at the time, but the first real venture into education in a big way was when he developed the Kingswood School. How important is that history for you today?
Well, John Wesley is so important to Kingswood School today. In fact, everything we really do at Kingswood School goes back to the fact that it's a school that was founded by John Wesley. We are a highly academic school, we know that, but we believe in so much more. And particularly, I think, from John Wesley, it's the values, the Christian values, which he was in the foundation of the school, which we really believe in so firmly today. The original school was, of course, founded in Bristol and moved to Bath in the 19th century. So our connections are not sort of literal in the sense of the actual buildings, but there's very much a sense that this is John Wesley's school, and we have some artifacts and such things from the original school, including Wesley's pulpit.
Simon, thank you for talking to us, and we're certainly grateful to talk to somebody from that very special school in the heart of John Wesley.
It's been a great pleasure.
Among the crowd, I also caught up with another special guest, friend and former BBC communicator, Frank Topping.
Frank Topping, it's a delight to talk to you again. Frank, you've been involved all your life, really, in the communication of the gospel. Tell me what Wesley Day means to you.
Well, I mean, Wesley, I don't know whether I am the only person, but I'm maybe one of the few people who came to Wesley by reading about him. And I came, but academically, if you like, but intellectually, I read his sermons, I read about his life and his story and everything else. And so, for me, here was this man who, like me, was wrestling, because I come from a different theological background, he was wrestling himself and found that why did we give intellectual assent to the teachings of Christ and so on? He didn't feel he had faith. In fact, at one time he told Peter Bowler, I think I've got to stop preaching, I haven't got faith. And Peter said, no, keep preaching. He said, preach faith until you've got it. Right. Now, and on this day, the 24th of May, 1738, out of nowhere it seems, while he was listening to somebody talking about Paul's letters, suddenly he felt his heart strangely warmed, and he suddenly said, I suddenly felt that Christ died for me, and that my sins are forgiven, even my, and that wonderful realization of the love of God reaching to, pushing aside all the kind of things that were preventing him from getting close. And in a sense, our job as preachers or as ministers is to try and unblock the way to Jesus. The message really is love. It's the message that Christ taught. It's the message that Wesley taught, and is now printed in the stone here. But an ounce of love is worth a pound of knowledge. And he lived his message as much as preaching. He was a great preacher. Some say not quite as good as Charles, but he was a great preacher nevertheless. But he preached mainly by what he did. I mean, he looked after the downcast, the outcast. He begged money and gave it away almost immediately to people. Even when he was 80, he was trudging through the streets of London, ankle deep in snow. I mean, at that age, I mean, incredible man.
Frank Toppin, it's a delight to meet you again. We've shared some times together, and that's enough. And it's good to share in the programme and talk to you. Thank you so much.
Great.
It's been 200 years since the first Methodists met in Australia. To celebrate 2 centuries of faith and pioneering care, CEO and presenter Reverend Dr. Keith Garner takes us back to where it all began.
But we don't begin here at the heart of London. We begin in a town in the north of England.
In this fascinating narrative, Reverend Garner chronicles the history of the life and times of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. This fresh and thought-provoking documentary takes us on a journey throughout the United Kingdom, beginning in John Wesley's hometown of Epworth.
John Wesley was born here on the 17th of June, 1703.
This 1-hour DVD travels onto his education years and beginnings of social justice in Oxford, to his final years in London. For more information on John Wesley, the man and his mission, call 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
Today, for our thought as part of our Wesley Impact, we're here at Lincoln College, Oxford, where John Wesley was a fellow, but Oxford University always had a very special place in his life. And it's one of the sermons that John preached when he was at Oxford at the great University Church of St Mary's, Oxford, that I want to remind you about. Now, this sermon was preached on the 11th of June, so we're just 2 or 3 weeks after that wonderful week that changed his life, where he came into a heartwarming experience, and so many things seemed to happen in such a short time. It was a new experience. His preaching, his life had come alive in a totally new way. And from the old Bible, we read the text, Ephesians 2 verse 8, "For it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith, and this not for yourselves, it is the gift of God." All the blessings that God has bestowed, said Wesley, all the blessings for the whole human race are a gift of God. And so grace is essentially at the heart of all faith, that unmerited love of God, that undeserved love of God made real to us. He asked the question, can a person atone for their own sins? Well, of course, his answer was not at all. What about your works, he said. And of course, he said, not at all. You can't do it no matter how hard you try. So in this sermon on salvation by faith in the great university church there, he asked questions about life. He said, what faith is it through which we are saved? Salvation became the watchword of this evangelist message. But what faith is it by which we are saved? Then he asked, what is the salvation which is through faith? And how may we answer some of the objections that people raise about faith? So firstly, what is it, the faith that by which we are saved? It's not merely the faith of he said a heathen, but it could have been anybody. The kind of faith that exists in the whole of life. In other words, we can't live life without a degree of faith. But the faith that saves is something rather different, something deeper, something more profound. And Wesley talked about that faith. It's not the faith which the apostles had. It's a faith that's genuinely his. It differs from the apostles. It differs from that which is handed down from other people. And it's a faith that really is one that acknowledges the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So what faith is it that we're saved by? Well, that is very, very distinctive. Secondly, he asked, what salvation is it which is through faith? Firstly, it's a present salvation. Very often when people talked about salvation, they talked about something that was way beyond this world. And so often people talk about salvation in those terms. But Wesley was quite clear that the salvation by faith that comes to a person is in the now. It is in the present. It's a salvation from sin. from those things that separate us from God. Sin, put simply, is I. Middle letter of the word is I. I want my way. I want to be noticed. I want to be important. All these things that so often are seen in life. Salvation sets the heart free, as Charles put it in one of his hymns. Oh, for a heart to praise my God, a heart from sin set free. Then the third question he asked, I suppose, has a multiple number of answers. He said, how may we answer the objections that people raise? And don't people still raise objections? They would rather believe salvation came some other way. There are many things that could be said. But you see, salvation is that salvation that produces holiness and the presence of God in our lives. Some would say, does not preaching this faith lead people to pride? Wesley said, no, this is a faith that we preach. It's a message we offer, not to make people feel good about themselves, not to find themselves elevated, but to recognize themselves in the presence of God. Finally, there will be those that contend that if a man cannot be saved by all that he doth, i.e. works and good deeds, will he not be driven to despair? The answer is yes. Wesley knew that. Just a few weeks earlier, he'd come to the end of himself. He'd come to realize that his works and his actions and his religious deeds were not enough. He needed that salvation which comes out of the grace of God. So we remind ourselves of this powerful message of the New Testament, because it's by grace that we are saved. And that salvation is not from ourselves, it's not of ourselves, it is a gift of God. So that message preached so long ago in the great University Church of St. Mary's, Oxford, is still real today, no matter what you do or I do. We cannot ever earn our salvation. It comes through the grace of God, and it brings meaning and peace and love to our lives. And that grace is for you.
To commemorate 200 years of faith and pioneering care in Australia, Wesley Mission has released a publication documenting its work in the community.
Everyone needs a little rest, everyone needs a little joy.
For more information on today's people, today's story, you can contact us on 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
Well, thank you for joining us here in the new room in Bristol. Well, we're going to go just a few hundred metres away next week when you join us as we talk about Charles Wesley, who lived very close to here, wrote over 6,000 hymns, and has helped to give voice, the sweet singer of Methodism, to the whole world church. That'll be an exciting programme, but for now, goodbye and God bless you.